a lot is going on right now in Ukraine. The Poroshenko, the president, has dissolved parliament, called for elections. The government is claiming that they have Russian soldiers that they're parading around. These aid convoys just went through. I mean, it's just been a lot in the news. And I wanted to check in with Professor Stephen Cohen. He really knows this stuff. He contributing editor to The Nation magazine, thenation.com, professor emeritus of Russian studies and politics at NYU and Princeton. His book, Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, examines the new Cold War. It's just out in paperback. And his most recent piece in The Nation, which you can read over at thenation.com, is titled The New Cold War and the Necessity of Patriotic Heresy, with the subtitle, U.S. Fallacies May Be Leading to War with Russia. Professor Cohen, welcome back.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you for joining us. First of all, if you could just frame this conversation, what's going on right now in Ukraine? What's going on between Ukraine and Russia? What's going on between the United States and Ukraine and Russia?
You know, you said a minute ago that Cohen, I really know this stuff. The most I can boast is I try hard to understand, but we're in, I guess, what used to be called the fog of war. There is so much misinformation, whether it's intended or unintended, coming out of Washington, particularly Kiev, the capital where the Ukrainian government is, and out of Moscow, that a person, you and I have to figure out what's true and what isn't true. But since we talked, to update the story, this seems to be the case. On the one hand, Kiev's bombardment, mortar attacks, heavy weapons attacks on the two Donbas cities in eastern Ukraine, Luhansk and Donetsk, has intensified. These are cities not necessarily populated by ethnic Russians, but by people who are native-speaking Russians, who have an affinity, and always had, with Russia that's political, economic, cultural, and marital. They're just so many intermarriages. So they look to Russia in all sorts of ways. And Kiev is trying to subdue the rebellion there that's been going on for 3 or 4 months against what the East considers to be an illegitimate government in Kiev, which came to power through a kind of street coup back in February, and which has been backed ever since by the United States and NATO. So that bombardment has turned into a real humanitarian catastrophe by any measure. According to the UN, 2,000 non-combatants, civilians, mainly old people, women and children who can't run fast enough, have been killed. And there appear to be, this is an estimate, nearly 1 million refugees, most of them having fled across the border into Russia, but to some 2 other places in Ukraine. So that's, by any criterion, a humanitarian disaster. The Russians, as your listeners will know, last week sent 200-odd trucks of supplies to Luhansk. In Russian, it's called Lugansk. There were a lot of military threats around that expedition, but the trucks went there, dropped off their goods, went back to Russia, and the Russians announced yesterday they're going to send a second convoy now to Donetsk, the larger city, previously of about 1 million, but the city has shrunken. So that's the kind of military humanitarian disaster. Meanwhile, there had been no diplomacy, but this past Saturday, German Chancellor Merkel went to Kiev. And today, as you and I talk, Tom, it's 8 hours later, but Putin arrived late. Russian President Putin is in Minsk, the capital of Belarus, which is very, very close in all respects to Russia, to meet with the European Union trade officials, but also, more importantly, with Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko. We don't know what's going to come out of that. Now, what's important, and I'll end here to give the other part of the story, is that while in Kiev, Merkel said there can be no military solution to this problem. That is, essentially, she told Poroshenko and said it publicly, there has to be a ceasefire.
Right. She also called for federalism, which I thought was remarkable.
Right.
And
that was the second thing.
The most underreported story in America.
That's right. In the beginning, when this what was a political crisis in February and March, and has now become the military crisis, The political issue and the solution seemed to be, this is what the rebels, and not only the rebels, but the Russians, but a lot of people elsewhere in Kiev wanted, because Ukraine is made up of very diverse regions, but it had a unitary state. For example, the president of the parliament named the governors of the regions. So the call for a federal constitution, federalization it is called, modeled either on the United States or Germany or Canada. Lots of countries have federal constitutions. But that got lost in the fog of war. And as a result, the Western media began to refer to everybody fighting in the East as separatist. The implication being they wanted to join Russia. Now, having been bombed to smithereens, they might now want to join Russia. But when this began, only about 20% of the people living in the rebellious areas actually wanted to join Russia. They wanted more home rule, or what we'd call federalism. So here's where we're at. We remain on the cusp of war between Russia and Ukraine, actual war, not covert war, which could bring NATO in. Today, the Secretary General of NATO made a ghastly statement looking ahead to the NATO meeting in Wales in September, where he called for the movement of NATO forces right to Russia's border, forward forces. And he said this would be a spearhead where we could rapidly intervene in Russia or attack. That's just inflammatory. He's completely out of control, though some political figures stand behind this guy Rasmussen. But the statement he made today was just provocative. He may have been trying to undermine the talks between Putin and Poroshenko, but we don't know the result of that. One other footnote for Americans. This whole attempt to woo Ukraine away from Russia began years ago, but the most forward attempt back in February was led by the European Union, with the White House kind of in the background. Though we became present, you'll remember that representatives of the State Department went to Kiev during the protests. John McCain went there. We got quickly involved. When the political crisis led to the downfall of the elected Ukrainian president, the United States, the White House, Obama and Secretary of State Kerry took the lead. After things got really bad, they kind of vanished, either because they failed as statesmen or they were distracted by Iraq, or whether Ferguson simply took all of Obama's attention. But what's happened now is Merkel, the German chancellor, has reemerged as the key statesman in this drama. One last point, and I'll quit. I think, but I don't know, that allegations that Russia Putin is sending higher quality, heavier weapons to the defenders of the Donbass is not undoubtedly, probably true. For this reason, I continue to think that Putin cannot let this Russified region of Ukraine fall. He simply can't. But desperately does he not want to intervene directly. So he's trying to see, along with sending humanitarian help, whether the native rebels of eastern Ukraine can push back the Ukrainian army that's closing in on these two cities. Now, there was a report yesterday, unreported in America, it came out of Moscow, that the rebels have scored stunning military victories in the last 48 hours, and that they've even surrounded, entrapped, about 3 or 4 divisions of the Ukrainian army around these cities. But if that happens, the military side would turn. But at the moment, the official version is the Ukrainian army is on a victorious march.
Hold on just a second.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We're talking with Professor Stephen Cohen, contributing editor to The Nation, thenation.com, about the situation in Ukraine. We'll be back with Dr. Cohen. Welcome back, Professor Cohen. Over the weekend, somebody on my message board over at thomhartmann.com had posted an article about the Ukraine, and they included a couple of YouTube videos to documentaries about World War II, the taking of Ukraine and then the loss of Ukraine by the Nazis. And they were both about a half hour long, and I just sat and watched them Sunday afternoon. And it was amazing to me, what I learned. I mean, the Nazis controlled Ukraine for about 2 years. When they took the region, there were these places where they murdered all the Jews. They murdered many of the Ukrainians. 5 million civilians died when they were pushed back out of particularly eastern Ukraine by the Russians, by the Soviets. They burned those eastern cities basically to the ground. These are presumably relatively new cities. Did I take away my lessons of history correctly from that? And B, if so, a lot of people who remember that, or most of the people who remember that, are dead now. But to what extent does that history of World War II tinge what's going on when Angela Merkel from Germany comes in and says, "I'll be the peacemaker here"?
The Russians have an expression, "Živaya historia," living history. For America, World War II is no longer living history. It's ceremonial history.
Right.
On certain anniversaries, we do certain things, but it doesn't affect our politics or our culture. In eastern Ukraine, certainly, possibly all of Ukraine, but certainly in Russia, World War II remains living history.
Yeah. Maybe
because something like 27 million Soviet citizens died in that war. What's happened here, and it's a very bad thing, is that American NATO policy, in the attempt to take Ukraine from Russia or out of Russia's sphere of influence, and actually bring it not only in the West to NATO, has kicked over the tombstones of World War II memory in Ukraine. And all these ghosts of World War II are now stalking the land in Ukraine.
Well,
of course, via TV, evoking memories in Russia.
Yeah, and one of the things that I saw in the documentary was that in Western Ukraine, as the Nazis were on their way, there was an army that formed of Western Ukrainians who swore allegiance to the Nazis and joined them when they showed up. There was a name for it. I forget the name.
That's right. And the leader of this pro-Nazi, anti-Soviet movement during World War II was a man named Stepan Bandera. And he's become the kind of ancestral figure of this party in Ukraine called Svoboda, Freedom Party, which is part of the ruling coalition in Kiev.
And this is the party that supported Hitler.
Well, they don't say. They've cleaned up their act. It's the party about which the European Union said in December 2012, right on the eve of the crisis, that its values were incompatible. Said it was anti-Semitic and the rest, incompatible with European values. But it's a full coalition member of the Kiev government. Worse than that, though, ultra-nationalist militia have formed since February, fighting now in the east. And many people think they are quasi-fascist militia. There's a debate there. But some of them fly a swastika-like sign, and of course that evokes the memories you just mentioned of World War II.
Remarkable. Professor Stephen Cohen with us. You can read his work over at The Nation, his most recent piece, The New Cold War and the Necessity of Patriotic Heresy. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Professor Stephen F. Cohen on the line with us, writing at The Nation, contributing editor to thenation.com. His piece, The New Cold War and the Necessity of Patriotic Heresy. His book is now out in paperback, by the way. The title is Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, which examines this new Cold War. And if you have questions or thoughts or want to dig deeper on this and have a conversation with me and Professor Cohen, our number is 866-987-THOM. Professor Cohen, when we hit the break, we were kind of talking about where we're at right now. Do you want anything you want to add to that, and where do you think this is all going? And we haven't even gotten to the Malaysian Airlines flight and all the kind of distractions that have happened in the midst of this.
Well, you're right. We haven't gotten to the shoot-down of the Malaysian passenger liner, because the original story put out by Washington and NATO, which really turned the tide in the political struggle over Ukraine and that it led to European sanctions, the original story was that it had been shot down by rebels using Russian equipment and possibly instructors. No official investigation has been concluded or announced, but independent investigations suggest that's not really what happened. And therefore, the story's been dropped in Washington. The White House never speaks about it anymore. It lingers on in the media as a kind of reflexive aftermath.
So what is
that version's been dropped? We don't know what happened to that airplane, but the original version does not, based on what we now know, seem to be the whole story.
Well, I've seen these websites, and in fact, I had somebody call about this yesterday who said that there are pictures of the wreckage that show what look like bullet holes going both in and out of the cockpit area, the fuselage, which would indicate that this plane was under fire from another aircraft. I just dismissed that as a conspiracy theory. Is that one of the serious possibilities?
That's more than conspiracy theory. That story came from German private aviational investigators who, based on blow-ups of the photographs of the fuselage and the cockpit, parts of the plane that had survived on the ground in large pieces, they said that those holes, which are shown to be entering, that is, it tore the skin of the plane inward, like an inward bullet, looked like 30-millimeter cannon fire, which is what's mounted on an airplane. It seems to be the case that 2 Ukrainian fighter jets were near the airplane at about that time. That's been reported by Russia and German radar or satellite imagery, but it's not been confirmed. The other part of the story that has a big question mark about it is, although at the beginning of the saga, it was said with certainty that the rebels had Buks, B-U-K. That's the equipment capable of shooting down a plane at such high levels. That evidence of the rebels of having the Buk now turn out to have been falsified. So we just don't know. We only know the following, that the Ukrainian military had Buks. They were Soviet-built. They've been built since, the 1960s. They're not hard to get by a standing army. Was there a Ukrainian unit in that area that might have shot it down? That is, an official by accident or intentionally. I can't believe it was intentional. But the problem here is Kiev will not release its communications, its flight controller communications, prior to the incident with the airplane. They refused to release it. Nor has the United States released its satellite imagery. We've been watching that area of eastern Ukraine around the clock. I mean, they can read the license numbers on military vehicles. They're always talking about the Russians did this, the Russians did that. But for some reason, the United States has not released the highly sophisticated information it had. If you take the worst view, the United States is not releasing that information because it disproves the official American story. And if that story would be disproved, it would be a catastrophe for American policy, and I think for Obama and Kerry personally, because they went with that story for a few weeks. But we just don't know, Tom. Some of the families whose loved ones died on the plane are using some international law, I don't know exactly what it is, to sue either the insurance company or the Malaysian government or the United States or NATO or Kiev to release all the information so there can be a public inquiry. But at the moment, it looks like, but I don't make this as an accusation, that's an impression, that a cover-up is going on and not by Russia. But we just don't know. But to bring this to the moment,
wouldn't Russia also have imaging of that area? I mean, aren't they probably monitoring it with their satellites just as thoroughly as we are?
Excuse me, Tom. They released their imagery, but was it complete? Was it a selective release? We don't know.
Right.
What they released showed those 2 Ukrainian jetliners flying near the...
You mean the fighter pilots, the fighter planes?
The fighter planes, I'm sorry, flying near the jetliner. There was some report that yes, but that was normal because it was a war zone and Ukrainian military aircraft were escorting planes through the war zone. That begs the question of why that plane was even in the war zone to begin with. But that has to do with civilian regulation. The fact is there's very suspicious evidence that has not been officially either investigated or commented on by the agencies in charge of deciding what happened. But it reminds us, Tom, and this is the point I want to get to, how close we are, I've said this from the beginning, from the time you and I began to discuss, to actual war with Russia. Because remember this scenario. If it's true that Moscow cannot let eastern Ukraine fall to Kiev, which means to Moscow, to NATO, and permit a NATO military base right on Russia's most important border, if that is true, and if the self-defenders, as they call themselves, cannot defend these Ukrainian cities in the east, then the likelihood of Putin deciding to intervene directly is very high. So what we're watching unfold today, both the negotiations in Minsk and the military move, is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, this is critical stuff. Can you stick around, sir?
Sure.
Great. We're talking with Professor Stephen Cohen, contributing editor to The Nation, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at NYU and Princeton. His book, Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, now out in paperback about this new Cold War, and you can read his most recent piece at thenation.com.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you 28 minutes before the hour. Professor Stephen Cohen on the line with us, contributing editor to The Nation, thenation.com, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at NYU and Princeton. His book, Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, which talks about this new Cold War, is now available in paperback. And his most recent piece for thenation.com, The New Cold War and the Necessity of Patriotic Heresy. Professor Cohen, given the nature of radio, people are constantly getting in and out of their cars, and a certain percentage of our listenership has turned over. We should probably sort of reboot the conversation with at least maybe a one-paragraph summary of what we've talked about up to this point. And in fact, Morris, listening on KPFK, has a question Vicky, listening in Cathedral City, California, has a question that I think might start that conversation. But you want to give us a quick summary of what we've covered so far?
Where we stand today, what began as a political conflict in Kiev in February has turned into a Ukrainian civil war and Ukrainian civil war. That civil war has become a kind of proxy war between the United States and NATO on the one side and Russia on the other. As the weeks have passed, diplomacy, a negotiated settlement, have faded the possibilities, and the war has grown worse and worse in eastern Ukraine, raising the real possibility of some kind of direct military conflict between Russia and the United States and NATO on the other side. This weekend and continuing today, there are negotiations. German Chancellor Merkel was in Kiev talking to the Ukrainian president on Saturday, and today, Monday, Putin arrived in Minsk, Belarus, to meet with the European trade negotiators, but also the president of Ukraine. So a glimmer of hope regarding negotiations, which would have to be preceded by a ceasefire on the part of Kiev, is now at least dimly visible, though I'm not very optimistic.
Yeah, there's a picture in the New York Times right now is of Poroshenko and Putin shaking hands. Apparently, they just met. Vicky in Cathedral City, California, you have a question for Professor Cohen?
Yes, I do. Hi, Tom.
Hi.
Professor Cohen, I might have missed it in what you said, but I don't understand why this all erupted anyway. I mean, here we were having the Olympics in Sochi, and then the next day, it seemed like, there was this invasion of the Ukraine. So I'm wondering what prompted that?
Well, it's good you don't understand, and that leads you to ask the question, what prompted that? The official American NATO version is that Putin prompted it, that he made a bid to snatch Ukraine from the West, just as Ukraine was agreeing to sign a proposal from the European Union about a trade relationship, and that everything's been provoked by Russian President Putin. But that isn't the full story. Back in February, the economic proposal that the European Union offered then-president and elected president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, included in the small print a couple of things that aren't discussed. One is, in effect, it would have sharply curtailed Ukraine's multi-decade-long trade with Russia. It would have been a devastating blow to the Ukrainian economy, and the European Union really wasn't offering more than austerity measures in return. The other clause in small print was a line that read, more than a line, a whole section, that by signing, Ukraine would have to adhere to the European Union's military and security policies. NATO wasn't mentioned, but the European Union's military and security policies are NATO. So it was, in a way, an attempt to smuggle Ukraine into NATO through the back door. And to that, as well as the overthrow of the elected government in Kiev in February, Russia, Putin, began to react. I would argue, though people have become angry at me for arguing this, though I do so in this article on the Nation Web and in the magazine on Wednesday, that Putin's been largely reactive. In fact, there are complaints in Moscow by harder line forces that he's too reactive. He doesn't take the initiative. He waits to react, which leaves Russia at a disadvantage. But the question you raise is something that historians, because we're at a turning point in history, there's no question about that historians will look back on and debate for decades to come. Though I think the first draft of history that I just gave you and that I presented in my writings will hold up. But there's a lot we don't know.
Well, and there's also, speaking of backstory, we don't need to go back to World War II. We can go back to the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the negotiations between President Gorbachev and President Bush, the elder, about NATO positioning itself near the Russian border, couldn't we?
And that's back in the news now because people understand, no matter what they say, that what's driving this crisis is the Russian perception that the West is trying to bring Ukraine into NATO, a perception that is, for which there is a lot of evidence. This has been going on for nearly a decade. And that's reminded people that in 1990, in return for Gorbachev's agreement that Germany would not only be reunited, this was in 1990, but that a united Germany would be a member of NATO, that he received on several occasions verbal and even informal written assurances, to quote then Secretary of State James Baker, Ukraine would not move 1 inch to the east. Now today, Ukraine sits on Russia's borders in the Baltic countries and is still on the move. So Russia has taken the view that Russia was betrayed. The promise was broken by Clinton in the 1990s and continued by Bush and tacitly by Obama. Betrayed Russia. The Western answer is yes, those things were said, but it was never put in a formal treaty or agreement, and that's your bad. And that's true. Gorbachev made a grievous mistake in not getting that in writing, though I think eventually we would have broken the promise anyway, even if in writing we're not exactly the greatest worshipers of treaties we've signed.
Ask any Native American.
It would have made a big difference. But that's a way of saying, don't believe anything we, the United States, tell you by way of a promise. You better get it in a treaty form because we're not reliable people. We're not a reliable nation. That's not good either.
Yeah. So where we ended the last segment, you were talking about. Actually, we've got a number of callers here who have questions for you. Let's Janet. I'm sorry, in Topeka, Kansas. You're on the air with Professor Cohen.
Yes, one of the questions I have with the sanctions and whatnot, and in the lead up to this, Russia has moved to the east and through the Eurasian agreements and with the BRICS, which threatens the dollar and the petrodollar especially. In the past, with U.S. military adventurism in Iraq, I've always thought that's what sealed Saddam Hussein's fate when he tried to move to the euro in the pricing of Iraqi oil. Do you have any comments on that? I think that may have influenced U.S. NATO's actions here.
Yeah, and there's also that $10 billion deal that Chevron just cut 2 years ago or a year ago with with the Ukrainian government to frack Ukraine.
I don't know the history of Saddam Hussein and basing oil on the dollar versus the euro. I do know that for a number of years, people in Moscow have argued against this continuation of basing all trade agreements, and particularly energy agreements, on the dollar, that it gives the United States an enormous advantage at a time when the United States is trying in every way to disadvantage Russia. When Russia signed this humongous oil agreement, natural gas energy agreement with China, and the months are rolling into one and another, but I guess that was in June or July, it was rumored that a large part of subsequent Sino-Russian trade agreements would no longer be based on the dollar, but on some mix of currency. Then Putin, as you rightly recall, your caller, went to Latin America for a meeting, a summit of the BRICS. And there the issue of not only changing to some other currency, but creating a bank to rival the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund was discussed, and the first steps were taken. So we could be driven, though the idea has been out there for years, but driven by the Ukrainian crisis, on the cups of an entirely new international fiscal system. That's possible. What this reminds us is that the premise in Washington has always been, since the Soviet Union ended, this was the grievous premise of Washington thinking, that Moscow had no good options other than to be nice to the United States. And therefore we could do to Russia, expand NATO, whatever we wanted, but there was nothing Russia could do about this. This has been false for 20 years, and now we see ramifications of that fallacy.
Remarkable. Professor Stephen Cohen is with us. His new piece for The Nation at thenation.com, The New Cold War and the Necessity of Patriotic Heresy. His book, Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, is now available in paperback from all the usual sources. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Oh, and there'll be an updated version of Professor Cohen's article up tomorrow on The Nation. We'll be back with Stephen Cohen right after this. And welcome back. Professor Cohen, Rich in Jefferson City, Missouri, watching us on Free Speech TV, has a question for you. Rich, you're on the air.
Well, I don't know if it's a question, more of an observation, but the United States made a big stink about the United States or Russia going into Crimea and saying that they didn't have justification. But we occupy the port of Guantanamo, which is the biggest port in Cuba, and we did it by force. We've had it for years. But the United States can't see that, or the public doesn't understand that we hold that's a sovereign country, and we hold their largest water port. And the Russia has interest there. I mean, they have, financial and all the what we call justifications that the United States does for invading Iraq and everything else. The Russians can make the same claim, and even more. Not legitimize what Russia did or is doing, but it's just as legitimate as what the United States is. But we can't, you don't get that White House press release saying, well, we do the same thing, but that was the observation. I thought you could comment.
Okay, let's get Dr. Cohen's thoughts on it. Professor?
What he says is correct, and there could be other examples given. More recently, what NATO did by severing the province of Kosovo, this was under Clinton, from Serbia by NATO bombing, was clearly a redrawing of European borders and an annexation of Kosovo. Even though it's an independent state, it's a protectorate of NATO, so you could say NATO annexed Kosovo, and the Russians cite that precedent. The problem with precedents is, where does it end? We can cite precedents. The United States is a country sort of founded on annexation, and acquisitions.
Yeah.
We go back to the Native Americans and what happened to them and their life. But where does it end? And usually it ends when great leaders emerge to create new precedents, saying this will stop or this will begin. Because I'm interested in leadership and because I'm an American, it grieves me that the United States has provided either no leadership or such lousy leadership in this crisis with Russia that has been in the making since the end of the Soviet Union. And the astonishing thing, Tom, I keep mentioning it on your broadcast because I know you reach a lot of elected officials. The astonishing thing to me is that we have approximately 535 elected members of Congress. We have a supposedly pluralistic and democratic mainstream media, and we have no debate about American policy toward Russia. I have yet to see a single person or newspaper with authority say, hey, this has come to this. Maybe we ought to rethink American policy toward post-communist Russia. The only thing you get is bad Putin. Putin. Yeah. To me, this is astonishing in the United States. Ferguson is causing us once again to rethink our race relations and policy in the United States. But evidently, when it comes to Russia, there's only one side of the story, and no rethinking is permitted in the mainstream. That's why I think your broadcast that you do, I know you have people who listen to you who are members of Congress and elsewhere. That's why I conjured up the expression patriotic heresy. This has become an orthodox in this policy toward Russia that's leading us toward war. But where are our elected politicians?
Yeah. Excellent point. We'll be back with Professor Cohen right after this. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. We're talking with Professor Stephen Cohen, contributing editor to The Nation, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at NYU and Princeton. His book, The Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, is now available in paperback. His article for The Nation, The New Cold War and the Necessity of Patriotic Heresy, you can read at thenation.com. There'll be an update to it tomorrow. Professor Cohen, do you mind if we take some more phone calls, or did you?
No, not at all.
Okay, great. Because I think we've got some really, really good questions here. Edward in Oceanside, California. You're on the air with Dr. Cohen.
Hello. Hope you guys are having a great day. I have a quick question, and I'll take it off the air. I would like to know if there's a connection between John McCain and Lindsey Graham and the Ukraine and arms dealing, and also is there a connection between the two with Syria? Given our history with the United States and Russia arming either side.
Okay. These are the two guys who went over to Saudi Arabia and talked to the Prince Bandar into supporting what now is known as ISIS. It seems, but
I don't know anything about the question that most informed readers of the American press don't already know. It seems pretty clear that Senators McCain and Graham never saw a civil war they didn't want to get the United States deeply involved in. After all, it was Senator McCain who went to Georgia in 2008 and said, we are all now Georgians. Then he went to Kiev in 2013 and said, we're all now Ukrainians. It's hard to know what citizenship we Americans now carry based on McCain's ambassadorship. There's a war party in Washington. It's not evil. It just has a notion that America can and should intervene in other civilizations, in other nations, to bring about a resolution that the United States thinks is wise. And the problem with that premise, and I've argued this ever since I entered Russian studies in the 1960s, is we Americans don't have the right, the wisdom, or the power to do such things in civilizations we don't even understand. This was the premise of our founding fathers, that we advocate liberty everywhere, but we're the defenders only of our own. There are exceptions to this, obviously, but it's become the rule.
Yeah.
And too many senators adhere to it. And I should add that this is a bipartisan consensus. I was watching on the usual place, MSNBC, last night, whose coverage of the Ukrainian crisis has been every bit as blame Russia only as has been Fox. Senator Christopher Murphy of Connecticut, supposedly a liberal and progressive senator, but he was saying the same thing basically as McCain and Graham. So this is not just the Republicans or even the war party of the Republican Party. It's bipartisan. Began with Clinton, continued with Bush, it's continued with Obama. And it can, unfortunately, in the area of foreign policy, only be changed in one of three ways. The grassroots movement, there is basically none any longer since the Soviet Union ended. Through the Senate using its constitutional rights to hold truly pluralistic hearings where these would be debated, the Senate has become a bastion of Cold War and doesn't do that, or through great leadership in the White House or the State Department. I think Obama and Kerry have vanished as statesmen in the European, in the Ukrainian crisis, and left it now with their fingers crossed to Merkel, the German chancellor, to save the day. But this is a very bad episode for America, and it teaches us that we really do need a new national security foreign policy. But where it would come from, I no longer know. It was different many years ago because we had the debate, we had senators who would be prepared to take the lead. We don't have that any longer.
Yeah. Kathy,
Tom mentioned earlier that there's a certain irony that Germany, which occupied and savaged Ukraine in
killed 5 million civilians,
is now the leading peacemaking nation in this crisis.
Yeah. Yeah. Kathy in Madison, Wisconsin, has a question for you. Kathy, you're on the air. Got to make it pretty short. We only have about 2 minutes left.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, can you hear me?
Just fine.
Hi. I just wanted to say, I know we could step back forever, but shouldn't we just step back a little bit more? And I'm basing this on articles that I have read in the Nation magazine, that Putin has been placing oftentimes wealthy or people who support him. It has been placing those people for years. What he did this year wasn't something that was just planned. That I think he's been planning this for a long time. He's been placing people in those communities, having them become leaders in the community. They're wealthy. And he has done this in other communities that he's then gone into, and I'm using communities
in eastern Ukraine. Kathy, let's get Professor Cohen's response to that.
Both Russia and the United States and NATO have been fighting a silent, usually silent war for Ukraine since the end of the Soviet Union, more than 20 years ago. Using people of influence who favor your position in this country has happened, but not only by Russia. We were deeply involved in the presidential election in Ukraine in 2004 and 2005. We played a leading role in overthrowing, in February of this year, the elected president of Ukraine. Now, he was a bad president. He was corrupt. He was not virtuous, but he was elected. And if you believe in democracy, you don't overthrow elected presidents. And in fact, the European Union had said his election was the freest and fairest in the former Soviet territories ever. But when you overthrow an elected president, even if he's a bad guy, you deal a body blow to democratization. And you can see what's happened since. Who has legitimacy in Ukraine now? Is it the president? During the new presidential election, nearly 40% of the country was unable to participate. A parliament which overthrew the president, and the president has now dissolved the parliament yesterday. The United States, which is deeply involved. Putin, who is deeply involved. Where do you draw the line?
Yeah, it's a mess. Professor Cohen, thanks so much for being with us again today.
My pleasure.
It's always a pleasure and an honor to have you with us. Again, I refer you to his work at thenation.com and his book, Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, which is now out in paperback.